But I know that for some of us, actually, the suffering that you've been enduring, whether it's to do with what you're going through at the moment or whether it has been other sufferings in your life, actually, they've been so profound that you may feel like, forget about prayer. I don't even know if I can keep going. I don't know if I can carry on. And that is what our next question expresses. So we have a really vulnerable question here from Logu, who's asked Vince, in light of the suffering in this world, is suicide the easy way out?
Yeah, thank you, Logu, for asking such a vulnerable question, and a question that many people are asking, I'm sure, around the world. And I'm not a licensed healthcare professional. Nothing that I can say should in any way be substituted for the advice of a psychologist or a psychiatrist or a mental health expert. Please hear me say that. But this is a question that we receive in one form or another at almost every open forum that we do now. We are dealing with a mental health crisis in America and in many other places as well. And it's also a question that hits home for us as a ministry, because the whole story of the beginning of this ministry starts on a bed of suicide, with Ravi, our founder, as a teenager, having tried to take his life and being on a bed of suicide, and someone coming in and giving a Bible and a passage being read from John chapter 14 to Ravi. And it's saying that because I live, because Jesus lives, you too shall live. And that was the moment of a turning point in Ravi's life, from a bed of suicide to this ministry and the team that surrounds him, and a life of true meaningfulness and true purpose. So if you are even in that place where you're on that bed of suicide right now, I want you to know that that's possible. I want you to know that just a word spoken by the God who loves you that deeply, the God who truly lives and therefore is the author of life and therefore can give you life, more is possible, and there is more in your future as well. You know, for those who are feeling the brokenness of this world very, very deeply, the Christian faith affirms that. It says that we live in a fallen world. It says that you should feel that brokenness. And sometimes it helps us to make sense of some of the mental challenges that we have. Think of just one example, separation anxiety. One form of anxiety where we're anxious about separation from either home or from people that we have a strong emotional attachment to. Well, the Christian faith and Christian theology, it makes some sense of that, because the Bible tells me that I'm not home. The Bible tells me that I'm a foreigner, that I'm an exile, that my primary citizenship is in heaven. And the Bible also tells me that I am separated from the relationship that should mean most to me, from the relationship with my Creator. And so it makes some sense of that. Sometimes theology can help us to explain some of the challenges that we deal with in the context of mental health. Oftentimes, what is said is that we are over-exaggerating or overestimating the fear that we have. The fear that we have overestimates or it exaggerates the reality of the circumstances that we're dealing with. And sometimes that's true. I mean, if you have an irrational fear of spiders and there are no spiders in the vicinity, then great, let's talk about that, let's fact check that, let's get some different habits of reasoning going, and let's see if we can deal with that. But I wonder if sometimes that's not always the case. You know, what are we supposed to do when our fears are not exaggerated? What are we supposed to do when we fear the coronavirus? What are we supposed to do when we fear that the relationships that mean the most to us won't last? What are we supposed to do when we fear suffering and loneliness and death? What are we supposed to do when our fears are not exaggerated, when our fears are grounded very clearly in the reality of our broken world? And I wonder if maybe the problem is not so much that we have overestimated our fears, but that we have underestimated the possibility of them being overcome. If God exists, could it be that through the eternal perspective that he can give us and through the eternal destiny that he can give us, that we could have that sense of home that we long for? If God exists, could it be that through the consistency and constancy of relationship with him, that could help us with some of the separation and some of the loneliness that we feel? Could it be that fear of being out of control, the root fear of a fear of spiders, could it be that fear of being out of control gets alleviated by the fact that actually we know there's a God who, in a deep sense, is in ultimate control? You know, this other part of your question here, is suicide the easy way out? I would caution against the word easy there with respect to suicide, because for many people it's an excruciating choice and an excruciating experience. But this phrase, the easy way out, it did catch my eye as we think about the pandemic that we're in currently. Because in the Antonine and Cyprian plagues of the 2nd and 3rd centuries, when people were literally running for the hills to flee from a pandemic, many of the Christians stayed in the cities to care for the sick and the dying. Rodney Stark says that statistically you were more likely to survive if you had a Christian as a neighbor, and that's one of the main reasons that Christianity grew in the first few centuries. Then you go to the 4th century and you get the Emperor Julian talking about how he can't squash Christianity. Why? Because they care not only for their own poor, but they care for our poor as well, even the non-Christian poor, and it continues on. You go to the 16th century, 1527, we had a plague in Wittenberg. Martin Luther, classes were moved, the university was moved, he stayed. And he turned his house into a hospital. And you think of the Ebola medical missionaries in 2014, they were Times Person of the Year because of the way they responded. Now, I know that that's a high calling, and that's not an easy calling, that's a difficult calling. And you may feel, especially if you're in this place where you're thinking about things like depression and anxiety and suicide, you might think that God can't use me for a high calling like that. Does he know the scars that I have? Does he know the shame that I'm living with? What I would want to say is that God can and desires to use you specifically now, and specifically because of the suffering and the brokenness that you have felt so deeply. You know, when Thomas had doubts about Jesus, and he said, I need to see the nail wounds. I need to put my finger there. I need to put my hand in his side. Jesus showed up and he said, take your finger and put it here. See my hands. Reach out your hand and put it into my side. Jesus had scars, and he kept those scars, and he was scarred for us, and he even offered for Thomas to be there vulnerably with him and to touch his scars. And so if you're approaching this whole season with scars, with shame, with depression, with difficulty, that does not discount you from God's plans. Far from it. In fact, Jesus convinced Thomas that he was willing to share his scars with Thomas, and maybe Thomas then knew that he could share his scars with Jesus. And I heard recently of a woman who had a long history of cutting herself. And this was specifically the story that spoke to her. If Jesus had scars, and if he kept his scars, and even though I have scars, God can still use me. And she said, I know now. This was after she had put her trust in Jesus. She said, I know now that my scars likely will not disappear, but I have hope that one day they will bear the glory of the one who was scarred for me. I think it's particularly in this time when people are suffering that you are going to be able to come alongside people and say, I've been there, I've felt what you have felt, I've known that fear, I've known that depression, I have those scars, and I will walk with you. I will show my scars to you, and you can show your scars to me, and we can walk through this together. I think God has a particular plan for your life, and I think it may be particularly in this season that that plan becomes more clear.
As Vince has mentioned, mental health challenges are extremely difficult to deal with, and they often require treatment and medication and support. So if you are struggling currently with suicidal thoughts, then please don't suffer alone. If you're here in the US, please do reach out to the National Suicide Helpline. And if you're elsewhere in the world, then you'll see a link on your screens which will take you to hopefully local resources where you can get help as well.